This will make you feel good, especially if you're listening to these Never Trumper idiots on some talk radio stations who make me crazy. They do not understand tariffs or Trump's strategy. They haven't bothered to understand it, and they just fire off at the mouth. They haven't done the work. The Chinese understand perfectly. This is a Financial Times. Financial Times, if you ever looked, a very respected left-leaning publication. This piece is by the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, not some right-wing blogger. The director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Listen to this. They think Trump is a genius. Who? The Chinese. Let me read to you what he wrote. Donald Trump is leading a double life. In the West, most foreign policy experts see him as a reckless, unpredictable, and self-defeating. But though many in Asia dislike him, as much as the Europeans do, they see him as a more substantial figure. I have just spent a week in Beijing talking to officials and intellectuals, many of whom are awed by his skill as a strategist and a tactician. This is where it gets interesting. I'm reading this to tell you what he's doing on trade, because this is a lot of what I've told you here. Few Chinese think that Mr. Trump's primary concern is to rebalance the bilateral trade deficit. So, by the way, I haven't even bothered to talk about trade deficits. I think the same thing. I don't think they matter. I don't think that's what he wants. I don't think he cares about trade deficits either. He cares about opening markets to true free trade. Few Chinese think that Mr. Trump's primary concern is to rebalance the bilateral trade deficit. If it were, they say, he would have aligned with the EU, Japan, and Canada against China rather than scooping up America's allies in his tariff dragnet. They think, listen to this, this is what I've said, they think the U.S. president's goal is nothing less than remaking the global order. Bingo. They think Mr. Trump feels he is presiding over the relative decline of his great nation. He is. It is not that the current order does not benefit the U.S. The problem is that it benefits others more in relative terms. To make things worse, the U.S. is investing billions of dollars and a fair amount of blood in supporting the very alliances and international institutions that are constraining America and facilitating China's rise. I would include Congress among those institutions facilitating China's rise, thanks to the K Street donations. But anyway, in Chinese eyes, Mr. Trump's response is a form of creative destruction. He is systematically destroying the existing institutions, from the World Trade Organization and the North American Free Trade Agreement to NATO and the Iran nuclear deal as a first step toward renegotiating the world order on terms more favorable to Washington financially. Once the order is destroyed, the Chinese elite believes Mr. Trump will move to stage 2, renegotiating America's relationship with other powers. Because the U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world, it will be able to negotiate with other countries from a position of strength if it deals with them one at a time, rather than through multilateral institutions that empower the weak at the expense of the strong. Bingo. This is, again, if you're wondering who I am reading, Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, writing in Financial Times. Not a Trump fan. The Chinese say that Mr. Trump is the first U.S. president in more than 40 years to bash China on three fronts simultaneously: trade, military, and ideology. They describe him as a master tactician, focusing on one issue at a time and extracting as many concessions as he can. They speak of the skillful way Mr. Trump has treated the Chinese president. Look at how he handled North Korea, one says. He got the president of China to agree to UN sanctions half a dozen times, creating an economic stranglehold in the country. China almost turned North Korea into a sworn enemy of the country. But they also see him as a strategist, willing to declare a truce in each area when there are no more concessions to be had, and then start again on a new front. Now listen to this. For the Chinese, even Mr. Trump's press conference with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, in Helsinki had a strategic purpose. They see it as Henry Kissinger in reverse. In 1972, the U.S. nudged China off the Soviet axis in order to put pressure on its real rival, the Soviet Union. Today, Mr. Trump is reaching out to Russia in order to isolate China. Bingo. And the best part of it is they don't have a real good creative response to him because we have all the cards, as I've been telling you for a long time. It's great art. It's a great piece. The Financial Times. Now, you look at this. Trump's trying to destroy the WTO and NAFTA. Why? NAFTA passes, right? And for the first 6 years, things aren't that bad. That's because the Chinese are still constrained by tariffs. But then Clinton allows them to join the WTO. What happens? See, and when you join the WTO, you get the tariff stripped off. So now they're passing all those Chinese goods illegally through Mexico and Canada. We can't stop them because of NAFTA. What happens? In 10 years, are you ready for that? In 10 years, after China joins the WTO, which is a pro-totalitarian organization and an anti-U.S. trade organization, in the 10 years, manufacturing employment plummeted by a third in America from 2000 to 2010 on Bush's watch. Nearly 6 million American factory workers lost their jobs. The drop was unprecedented, worse than any decade in U.S. manufacturing history. Even during the Great Depression, factory jobs shrunk by only 31%. I mean, this is a devastation. And they're saying, look, Trump is trying to destroy the very institutions that continue to keep this happening and in place to the benefit of China and the detriment of American interests. They're afraid of him for good reason. And they're not sure how to keep him from winning the trade war from China. And that's because they are much more dependent on us, exporting to us, than we are on exporting to them. We barely export to them, so it's not a loss for us to isolate them. And some products may cost a little more in the short term. We may lose a couple of jobs, but nothing we can't get back in spades when we win. And they think we might. It's the opposite of what you're being told.